Harlem, spring, 1988. Frank Lucas walks out of a federal correctional facility in New Jersey on a Tuesday morning. He is 63 years old. He has served time twice, once for the operation that made him a legend, once for the smaller, less disciplined dealing that followed his first release. He is, by any measure, a man who has paid a significant portion of his debt to a legal system he helped corrupt. He takes a cab to Harlem. He has not been in Harlem, really in it, present in it, walking its streets as a free man, for the better part of a decade. The cab turns onto 116th Street, and Frank Lucas looks out the window. What he sees stops something inside him. The neighborhood is the same geography, the same blocks, the same buildings, the same avenues he walked for 20 years as its invisible emperor. But the texture of it has changed in ways that are not architectural. The change is in the people, in the quality of the activity on the corners, in the speed of certain transactions, in the specific, recognizable posture of people in the grip of something new and worse. Crack cocaine had arrived in Harlem while Frank Lucas was inside. What crack had done to the neighborhood he left is not something that can be described with the same analytical distance Frank Lucas brought to most things. Because what crack had done, he understood immediately and with a clarity that was almost physical, was take everything he had built, the supply chain logic, the distribution architecture, the street-level market structure, and run it through a machine that stripped out every element of discipline, of organization, of the particular controlled ruthlessness that had characterized his operation, and left only the extraction. The invisible empire had been, in its way, careful. Frank Lucas had run it with standards. Violence was controlled because uncontrolled violence attracted attention. Product quality was managed because consistent quality built market loyalty. The organizational structure had discipline because discipline was what made the thing sustainable. The crack economy had none of this. It was faster, louder, more violent, more visible, more destructive per square block than anything Frank Lucas had operated. It moved through neighborhoods not with the quiet efficiency of a managed supply chain, but with the specific devastation of something that had no interest in sustainability, because sustainability was not the goal. The goal was extraction. Pure, immediate, total. Frank Lucas looks out the cab window at the neighborhood he built his legend in. He sees what his legend's infrastructure helped make possible. He sees what came after the invisible empire, what grew in the soil the invisible empire cultivated, what the market he helped establish, and the distribution logic he helped develop had been adapted to serve. He sees what he helped build toward without intending to build toward it. He gets out of the cab. He walks. He is trying to understand something. 18 months later, a young man named Marcus will knock on his door. And Frank Lucas will have his answer. To understand what Frank Lucas saw when he came back, you need to understand what he was comparing it to. Harlem in the early 1970s, the Harlem of Frank Lucas's empire, was a neighborhood under economic and social pressure from multiple directions. The legitimate economy was retreating. Manufacturing jobs had left. The civil rights legislation that was supposed to open new doors was only beginning to crack them, unevenly, for a subset of the population. The neighborhood's institutions, its churches, its community organizations, its political structures, were strained by demand that outpaced resources. And yet, the neighborhood had a texture. It had an economy, formal and informal, that functioned with a kind of coherence. The numbers racket, the various street-level trades, the informal service economy, these things had structure. They had, in their own way, rules. Not moral rules. Operational rules, the rules of enterprises that depend on sustained community relationships to continue operating. Frank Lucas's heroin operation was part of this economy. It was destructive, profoundly, irreversibly destructive, in the ways that the previous episode documented. But it was destructive in a particular register, slowly, progressively, across years of addiction that hollowed out individuals and families and the community's capacity to absorb loss. This is not a defense of heroin. It is a description of heroin's particular economics, which are the economics of a commodity that creates its own demand and extracts payment over time from a captured market. Crack cocaine had different economics. Crack was cheaper per dose than heroin, cheap enough to be accessible to people who could not afford a heroin habit. It was faster acting, The high arrived in seconds rather than minutes. It was more immediately addictive. The neurological hook was set faster and harder. And it produced a different kind of market, not the relatively stable relationship-based market of heroin distribution, where established dealers served established customers with a product of known quality, but a volatile, competitive, violently contested market where the speed of the transaction and the accessibility of the price point meant that competition was constant and violent and resolved by whoever was willing to escalate furthest. The crack economy had no Frank Lucas. It had no organizational principle that valued discipline, sustainability, or the controlled management of violence. It had operators who were younger, faster, less concerned with the long game, operating in an environment where the long game was not available because the product moved too fast and the competition was too immediate. What it had was the infrastructure. The street-level market infrastructure that the heroin trade had spent decades building, the distribution points, the customer relationships, the community acceptance of certain kinds of commercial activity in certain spaces. This infrastructure was available to crack when crack arrived. The market was already there, waiting to be served by something faster and cheaper and more immediately destructive. Frank Lucas's empire had helped build that infrastructure. He did not know when he built it what it would eventually be used to serve. He knew now. Frank Lucas walked Harlem for weeks after his release. Not with any specific purpose. Not running an operation, not making contacts, not doing the reconnaissance that would have preceded a return to business. Just walking, looking, trying to understand what had happened to the neighborhood he had spent 20 years in. What he saw was an acceleration of everything he had contributed to, stripped of the discipline that had, in his telling of it, made his version of it different. The corners were different. In Frank Lucas's time, the corners were managed, not openly, not with the kind of visible activity that made law enforcement's job simple, but with the specific low-profile organization of a business that understood that visibility was a liability. The transactions were quick, low-profile, conducted between people who knew each other or were vouched for. The corners in 1988 were different. Crack's economics demanded volume and speed. The transactions were faster, more numerous, more openly conducted because the volume required couldn't be managed through the careful relationship-based distribution that heroin had used. The corners were hot, active, visible, contested. People who should not have been out there were out there. Children. Frank Lucas had run an operation that kept its street-level activity as invisible as possible. What he saw on Harlem's corners in 1988 was the street-level activity maximally visible, conducted without the minimum operational discipline that his era had required. He saw the product's effects more directly than he had in his operational years. Heroin addiction has a particular presentation. The nod, the specific slowing of the body's systems, the progressive withdrawal into dependency that, at its worst, produces the hollow-eyed visibility of a body consuming itself. He had seen this in Harlem. He had understood it as connected to his operation without looking at it directly. Crack addiction had a different presentation. More agitated, more desperate, with the specific frantic energy of a drug that produces an intense high and withdraws it quickly, leaving the user in a state of urgent, focused need. The people Frank Lucas saw on Harlem streets in 1988 were not the slow, progressive deterioration of heroin addiction. There was something more immediately legible as devastation. He looked at it directly. Something in the looking was different from anything he had done in 20 years of running the operation that contributed to what he was looking at. He had not, in those 20 years, looked directly at what his product did to the people who used it. He had managed the operation. He had maintained the supply chain. He had processed the market intelligence reports and adjusted the price and kept the organization running. He had been, in the fullest sense of the word, an operator. Walking Harlem streets in 1988, he was not operating. He was just looking. And what he saw, what he had helped build toward, what he had helped make possible, the infrastructure he had helped establish that was now being used to distribute something worse, this was not something he could process with the same analytical distance that had characterized everything else. He was 63 years old. He was out of the game, or mostly out of it. He had a perspective that his operational years had not permitted. He had the specific, uncomfortable perspective of a man looking at the consequences of his choices from the outside. It was not a comfortable place to stand. 18 months after Frank Lucas's release, in the fall of 1989, a young man named Marcus Johnson knocked on his door. Marcus was 20 years old. He had grown up in Harlem. He had grown up, specifically, in the mythology of Frank Lucas, in the stories that moved through the neighborhood about the Invisible Emperor, the man who beat the Italian mob, the organizational genius who had built something from nothing and made it last longer than anyone thought possible. To Marcus, Frank Lucas was not a criminal. He was a model, an example of what a man from Harlem could build if he was smart enough and disciplined enough and willing enough to do what needed doing. Marcus had been studying Frank Lucas the way other young men studied successful businessmen. He knew the outline of the operation, the sourcing, the country boys, the organizational architecture. He knew the legend. He wanted to know the man. He had heard, through the specific grapevine of a neighborhood that knows where its significant figures are, that Frank Lucas was back. That he was in Harlem. That he was, apparently, not running anything, just present, just there. Marcus knocked on the door. Frank Lucas opened it. He looked at this 20-year-old young man, this boy really, with the specific combination of intelligence and ambition and hunger that Frank Lucas recognized immediately because he had seen it in the mirror at 20 and had spent 50 years following where it led. And he understood exactly why Marcus was there. He let him in. They sat in the kitchen. Frank Lucas made coffee. Marcus began to talk. He talked the way young men talk when they have been waiting for a particular conversation for a long time. He talked about the neighborhood, about his options, about the legitimate economy's closed doors, the jobs that paid nothing, the apartments that cost too much, the schools that had failed to prepare him for anything the economy was actually offering. He talked about what he could see on the streets, the money that moved, the operations running. He talked about Frank Lucas, about what Frank Lucas had built, about what he wanted to build. Frank Lucas listened. He listened the way he had always listened, with the complete, focused attention of a man who processes information seriously. He did not interrupt. He did not perform reactions. He listened until Marcus had said what he had come to say. Then he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you something that nobody told me, and you're going to have to decide what to do with it." Marcus waited. Frank Lucas began to talk. What Frank Lucas told Marcus Johnson in that kitchen in the fall of 1989 is not in any public record. Frank Lucas has not given an interview in which he describes this conversation. Marcus Johnson has not been located or identified. The conversation exists in this telling as a composite, constructed from what Frank Lucas has said in various public contexts about his later views on the drug trade, about his relationship to the devastation his operation contributed to, about what he wishes had been different, and what he would say to young men who wanted to follow the path he had taken. What he said, in some form or another, was this. He talked about the operation, not the legend of it, not the mythology, but the reality. The specific reality of what it had required and what it had cost. Not just the legal costs, the arrests, the sentences, the cooperation and its consequences, the other cost, the ones that didn't make the myth. He talked about the people who had worked for him. The country boys who had left their families and come north and served time and carried the weight of the operation on their backs for what they had been paid, which was not enough for what they had risked. He talked about Calvin Reed, not by name maybe, but the reality Calvin Reed represented, the oldest friend who had sat in silence for 72 hours out of loyalty, who Frank Lucas had walked in and told to talk, who had served his 18 months and gone back to Newark and been permanently marked. He talked about the women, Clara Thomas, Dorothy Reeves, the nurses and teachers who had carried cash and counted money and maintained the safe houses, who had served their sentences for functions that the mythology did not record them performing, who had disappeared back into the neighborhood's anonymity carrying a history that nobody asked about. He talked about Harlem, about the streets he had walked after his release, about what he had seen, about the connection, the one he had spent 20 years not looking at, between what he had built and what had come after, the infrastructure that the heroin trade had established, the market the crack trade had taken over and turned into something worse. He talked about the specific arithmetic of it, the way an operation that extracts value from a community, even one that provides certain things back, even one that pays rent and funds basketball leagues and settles disputes and ends the Italian mob's tax, is still, fundamentally, an extraction. And extractions compound. They leave a community with less than they found it with. Less organizational capacity, less human capital, less of the specific, irreplaceable resource of young people who are alive and capable and present rather than addicted or dead or incarcerated. He told Marcus, "I was smarter than almost anyone I ever met at what I did. I was better at it than anyone who ever tried to do the same thing. I lasted longer and made more money and caused more damage and went further than anyone in my world ever had. And I am sitting in this kitchen at 64 years old telling you not to do it. Not because you'll get caught. You might not get caught, at least not for a long time. I didn't get caught for 6 years. Not because you'll go to prison. Prison is survivable. I survived it twice. Because of what you'll see when you get out. Because of the walk I took through this neighborhood when I came home. Because every person I saw on those corners was someone's nephew. Someone's son. Someone I helped put there, in ways I didn't intend and wouldn't have chosen if I'd been looking at it straight. I wasn't looking at it straight. You're sitting here because you want me to tell you how to do what I did. I'm telling you instead what I should have been told when I was sitting where you're sitting. Don't. Not because it's wrong in some abstract way. Because of the walk. Because of what you'll see when you finally look at it straight. Because I looked at it straight, and what I saw was what I'd done. And there is no money, Marcus said quietly. And in this telling, he uses the name, though maybe he didn't in the actual kitchen. There is no money that pays for what that looks like. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "What should I do instead?" And Frank Lucas, who had spent 50 years answering the question of how to extract maximum value from any situation, found himself face to face with a question he was not sure he had the answer to. He said, "I don't know. I know what not to do. I'm not sure I know what to do instead. But I know this, the thing I was good at, the organizing, the thinking ahead, the keeping track of 100 moving pieces, that thing works in other places too. It works in legitimate places, places that don't leave you walking through a neighborhood trying to understand what you helped destroy. I wasted that thing on this. I was the best at it. And I wasted it. Don't waste yours." Frank Lucas told Marcus Johnson not to follow him. Whether Marcus listened is not part of the public record. Marcus Johnson is a composite, a name attached to the reality of dozens of young men in dozens of conversations in 1989 and in the years after, who encountered Frank Lucas in his post-incarceration life and received some version of what he received in that kitchen. Some of them listened. Some of them didn't. This is the specific limitation of the lesson that Frank Lucas had to teach. The lesson was real. The conviction behind it was genuine. Whatever else Frank Lucas was or was not in his long and complicated life, the evidence suggests that the walk through Harlem in 1988 produced something that was not performance. Something that was not the calculated positioning of a man managing his public image for a post-incarceration world. Something that was just a man looking at what he had done. But the lesson could not undo what it was teaching about. The walk through Harlem documented devastation that was already complete. The young men Frank Lucas talked to were already living in the world the drug economy had made. The alternatives he gestured toward, the legitimate uses of organizational intelligence, the paths that didn't end in a walk through a changed neighborhood. These were real possibilities for some of them and not available for others, depending on the specific circumstances of their specific lives. The lesson was true. The lesson was insufficient. This is not a criticism of Frank Lucas's sincerity. It is a recognition of what individual lessons can and cannot accomplish in the face of structural conditions. A man telling a 20-year-old not to enter the drug trade is making a real intervention. That intervention operates in a world where the drug trade's pull is structural, rooted in economic conditions, in the absence of legitimate alternatives, in the specific geography of opportunity that Harlem's young men occupied in 1989. Individual moral clarity does not dissolve structural conditions. Frank Lucas had clarity. He expressed it. He expressed it to Marcus and to whoever else sat in that kitchen over the years and heard some version of what Marcus heard. The neighborhood was still the neighborhood. The streets were still the streets. The young men Frank Lucas was talking to were still living in the world that the drug economy, his drug economy and everything that came after it, had helped make. He could tell them not to follow him. He could not give them a world that made not following him easy. This is the specific, irreducible tragedy of the last lesson. It was learned too late to undo what it had taken a lifetime to produce. It was offered to people who needed more than a lesson. It was true, and it was insufficient, and it was the best that Frank Lucas had left to give. The invisible man had finally looked at what his invisibility had concealed. What he saw, he could not unsee. What he saw, he could not undo. He could only sit in the kitchen with a 20-year-old and say, "I know this story from the inside, and from the inside it looks like this. Don't follow me here." Frank Lucas died on May 30th, 2019. He was 88 years old. In the years between his final release and his death, he gave interviews. Many interviews. He became in the cultural universe that the Ridley Scott film had created and the true crime genre had expanded, something like a celebrity. He appeared at events. He was photographed with rappers. He was asked repeatedly to tell the story of the invisible empire, the blue magic, the chinchilla coat. He told those stories. He was good at telling them. He also told other stories. The ones that didn't fit the mythology as neatly. The walk through Harlem. The kitchen conversations. The specific quality of the reckoning that had settled into him in the years after his second release. He told these stories less often. They were not the stories that interviewers came for. But he told them. The question of what Frank Lucas was worth, in the full moral accounting of a long, complicated, consequential life, does not have a clean answer. He built something extraordinary and used it to devastate a community he was also, in genuine ways, part of. He cooperated with federal authorities and produced accountability for dozens of corrupt law enforcement officers, while also doing what cooperation always does, making a deal that was good for him. He walked through Harlem and looked at what he had helped build toward. He sat in kitchens and told young men not to follow him. He was not redeemed by this. Redemption is a specific transaction. It requires that the good done cancels or outweighs the harm caused. The harm Frank Lucas caused is not the kind that can be canceled by kitchen conversations, however sincere. The people who died from blue magic are still dead. The families destroyed by addiction are still carrying what addiction destroyed. The young men recruited into the drug trade and the infrastructure Frank Lucas helped build are still wherever that trade took them. The kitchen conversations were real. They were not enough. What Frank Lucas was worth, in the end, is the question that his life poses without answering. The question of whether a man can understand, late in life, the full weight of what he did, and whether understanding constitutes a form of justice for the people who paid for what he did, and whether it matters that he finally looked straight at it. He looked. He told Marcus not to follow him. He could not give Marcus a world that made not following him easy. He could only offer what he had, the lesson that cost a lifetime to learn. Whether it was worth what it cost is a question that Frank Lucas could not answer. Neither can we. What we can say is this: he learned it. And in a life full of things that were never said, and never acknowledged, and never looked at directly, that is not nothing. It is also not enough. Both of these things are the complete truth.